I'm going to walk around. I need to move a little bit. What I'm hoping today to do is to talk a little bit about how I view forages, and I hope to inspire you to think about forages maybe in a little different way. And what you might not know about me is actually I'm a twin, but it's a sad story. My twin was separated from me at birth, and unlike my twin, I wasn't exposed to the great environment. So I grew up in Saskatchewan and dealt with the cold, and my twin brother was in a much nicer environment here in the Lethbridge area. And I want you to think about this from a forage perspective. Okay, so we can have the same plant variety, right? But they grow under very different conditions, and recognize every year is different. And because of that, the quality of that forage differs by year. Now with times, of course, growing conditions, early life nutrition, well-managed stress. You can see I clearly don't manage my stress very well. My hair falls out. I don't know what work-life balance is. And so you get two very different outcomes, okay? So Rob, welcome back, brother. It's great to see you, okay? Jokes aside, I want you to think about forages like this, right? And when we're formulating diets for feedlot cattle, the forage we grow this year is going to be different than the forage we grow next year. And I want you to think about, are we using the same nutritional inclusion strategies across years when we're formulating those diets? Or is there something else we can be looking at to help improve our ability to consistently produce cattle at the same efficiency, at the same rate? And if so, what are those characteristics? Okay. So we're going to take a couple steps back and think about why we put roughage in diets, because it's a bit of a pain, right? Nobody really wants to deal with silage. There's lots of shrink. There's lots of issues associated with mixing, chopping, the ensiling process, covering, uncovering, right? Especially those massive piles. Okay, but we're doing this because generally we dilute energy through the provision of fiber. And I'll show you what happens if we don't dilute energy, right? And then at low inclusion rates, so this is one of those drugs or pills where a little bit is good and a lot can be negative, and none is also bad, right? So at low inclusion rates, we can actually help those cattle maximize energy intake. So it's one of those interesting situations where we can slightly dilute the energy density, but because that's forage is there, they can actually eat more total nutrients, okay? We also want to promote chewing activity. So that fiber is going to provide the stimulation to promote rumen contractions, rumen mixing, and short-chain fatty acid absorption. And I should have put saliva production because that's what we think about when we have chewing activity. But we can't forget that when we have these acids that the microbes produce in the rumen absorbed, the rumen wall is secreting bicarbonate. Okay, and it's not talked about enough, but there's actually more bicarbonate secreted by the rumen wall than there is from saliva. So I care more about nutrient absorption because then the cattle are getting energy that they use to support maintenance and growth. And at the same time, they're buffering that rumen, okay? We want to maintain rumen fill. That comes back to supporting those rumen contractions. And then, of course, that energy dilution, coupled with all of the promoting effects on rumen function, help us reduce risk for bloat and manage risk for rumen acidosis. Okay, so a lot of good reasons to put forage or roughage into diets. Okay, so I went to the Cumberland Valley Analytical website and I restricted samples to Alberta from 2021 to 2025, so 5 consecutive production years. And I pulled what I think are probably forages you might see on your operations, so corn silage, barley silage, rye silage, wheat silage, and straw. And I'll be the first to admit, when you look at the Cumberland Valley, it says barley forage. And when I looked at the dry matters, it was a little high, which is why they're not on here. And the same would be true for rye silage or rye forage and wheat silage. Otherwise, they look pretty representative. Okay, so recognize some of these might be green feed, but we can make the argument for today that they're probably okay for silage. Pretty big range in crude protein, pretty big range in starch, pretty big range in fiber, whether you look at NDF or ADF, and because of those differences, big differences in energy. And yet sometimes, not always, but sometimes we just call them forages and we put them in the diet at the same inclusion rate. Okay? Recognize that they have tremendous differences in chemical composition. Okay, so I'm not criticizing anyone but myself. This is a study we ran at the university a few years ago, quite a few years ago now, where we were comparing barley silage and corn silage, and we fed that with barley grain or corn grain or a blend of both. And all I want to do is focus right now on the silage component. So we had 8% of our dietary dry matter as barley silage, and to evaluate the corn silage, we just took out the barley silage and we put in the corn silage. Okay? Pretty simple strategy. But we know the chemical composition is very different for corn, a lot more starch, a lot less fiber. And so when we look at a dietary level, we can see that show up again, right? When you look at the average of these three treatments, the starch is lower for barley than it is for corn, and the NDF is going to be higher for barley than it is for corn, regardless of the cereal grain that's included. Okay? So again, at the bottom, essentially replacing barley silage and putting in corn silage increases the energy density of the diet, and so it shouldn't be surprising when we look at hot carcass weight, we get a positive response, even though we didn't pick up differences in dry matter intake, average daily gain, or gain to feed. We have more sensitivity at a carcass level. So we see the direct effects coming from the dietary energy density driving a greater performance outcome, an economically important outcome, over 6 kilos a carcass when we bring in more corn silage. Okay? So we can take one step further, and instead of thinking about just direct ingredient substitution, we can start thinking about percent roughage or roughage NDF. Okay, and when we look at a previous survey of feedlot nutritionists or consultants in the US, right, about 54% of them are looking at either roughage NDF or NDF as a whole. Okay, and if we look at the relationship between dry matter intake, as we start increasing NDF from roughage, we start increasing our dry matter intake. Now I think in Western Canada, we need to think about these data a little bit more than we might if we were only feeding corn. Right? Barley contains a lot of fiber. Okay, and that barley fiber is not, that barley fiber does contribute somewhat to chewing, but it's not the same as roughage. Okay, so this is a study that shows that response to enhance energy intake very well. These are alfalfa hay treatments. So their forage in this case was alfalfa hay. And as they increased the alfalfa hay, they got an increase in average daily gain, okay, and an increase in gain to feed, but only when going from 2% alfalfa hay to 6% alfalfa hay. And after that, it started dropping off again. Okay, so it really shows how small amounts can be positive. And then as we continue that energy dilution, we start seeing some of those realized effects caused by that dilution outcome. Okay. So pretty common survey or survey approach, 23 studies used in this experiment or meta-analysis. It represented 110 treatments, and they wanted to look at the relationship between dietary NDF and dry matter intake, growth, gain to feed, and hot carcass weight. And not surprising, as we increase that NDF in the diet, we're diluting out the energy, so cattle may eat more, and that's what they observed. Average daily gain has a much lower slope, so even though they're eating more, Each bite contains less nutrients, so they don't grow as fast. Okay, so it results in a negative response for gain to feed and a negative response for hot carcass gain. So the question is, how much fiber do we need to feed to cattle to meet those physiological requirements without getting to the point where we're going to start compromising some of our performance outcomes? Okay, I want to highlight that we can have tremendous effects of forage sources, or we can have tremendous effects from the forage source even though we have low inclusion rates. And I've already shown you one study where we had corn versus barley only at 8% of the dietary dry matter. This is one where we replaced barley silage with rye silage. They were not cut at the same physiologic maturity. Okay, the rye silage was cut much earlier. But when we increased rye silage inclusion in our finishing diets, okay, by replacing half or all of the barley silage, we saw very modest changes in starch, okay, and very modest changes in NDF. And in fact, if I saw these analyses in the lab or from a lab, I would say I'm not sure 20.8 is different than 21.4. That's pretty normal variation, okay, at least with that type of assay. But we can have tremendous performance outcomes. So we saw a linear reduction in dry matter intake, a linear reduction in average daily gain, a linear reduction in final body weight, a reduction in dressing percentage, hot carcass weight, and not surprising, if we see all those responses, which are probably driven by the lower dry matter intake, we see lower proportion of cattle with, a higher proportion of cattle with no abscesses and a lower proportion of cattle with severe abscesses. So I don't bring this in to challenge rye use. There's many reasons to incorporate rye into a finishing forage program. But what I want to highlight is the forage source probably matters more than we're thinking about. Okay? And if we feed this forage source to a whole feedlot, we probably can't measure those outcomes because we have year-to-year variation, cattle variation across batches, and so we might not know what outcomes we're facing. So this gets us back to a point that NDF is not an accurate descriptor. So I went back to that meta-analysis, and if you just focus on the green squares, these are cattle fed the same dietary NDF, but you can see their dry matter intake response is very different. So maybe eating about 8 kilos versus 9.6 kilos at the same dietary NDF. That would be a low NDF in a barley-based ration. So if we move up more around that 20%, we can really find the same thing. So if we're just looking at NDF, and these are with corn-based diets, we're not telling a very important part of the story. We're missing something that's capturing or explaining a lot of that variation. So what else can we actually evaluate? And I think people need to pay attention to ANDFOM. And of course, we're nutritionists. Maybe we don't like abbreviations as much as the microbiologists, but we love our abbreviations. Okay, and so ANDFOM is just NDF that has been ASH corrected. Okay, and I'll tell you why. First one is the NDF assay is anything but precise, and it certainly does not only tell you the fiber. So anything that does not dissolve, when you put that sample in neutral detergent solution, we pull that sample out, we measure how much is there by weight, and everything that's there by weight we say is NDF. It's not. It's just what wasn't soluble in that solution. Okay? Well, ash is not soluble in that solution. Okay, so if we're dropping forage to cure it, if we're beside heavy used grid roads, now is a great time in winter, right? You drive down the grid road, you can see the dust from the grid road over that nice white fresh snow. That happens in winter too, right? But it's not landing on the snow, it's landing on your forage that you then cut, harvest, and pack in silage. And if you only measure the NDF across these sample types, and again, this is Alberta data for barley silage, we're probably over accounting for our NDF by about a percent and a half. And if we get into straw, it might be as much as 5%. 5% of that NDF might be ash. Okay? So that means if we're putting that straw or putting those silage sources in as NDF, we actually think there's more NDF in that sample than there is. Okay, so we're actually probably feeding a little less NDF than we think we are if we're not correcting for ash. Now for some samples, like corn silage, probably no point, right? And why might that be? We tend to cut higher, right? We probably don't wilt, so there's less risk for soil or dirt contamination in those samples. Okay, so the potential bias on our NDF is a bit lower. Okay, so if we go back again and we think about what else we can evaluate, let's think again about our goals. So this is really similar to the reasons, but I've rephrased or reconstructed how I think about them. So again, I want to support energy intake without too much energy dilution. Our goal is to grow and fatten cattle. I want to maintain rumen function, and I could assess that based on rumen motility or rumen mixing. I could assess that based on nutrient digestion. I could assess that based on absorption of those acids that the microbes are producing, and I could assess that based on salivation. And when we do that, we know that even with forages that have the same NDF, they have very different efficacy at promoting those outcomes. So this really highlights, again, NDF, not only is it a poor assay, but it's not telling us the biology that we want it to explain in diets for our cattle. And this is another example. Okay, so this is a study where we compared barley versus wheat silage. It was included in the diet at 10% of the dry matter. NDF, 19.1 versus 19.5. Again, I would say they're the same, or at least not very different. Starch was 53 in both. Energy was essentially 1.2 megacal per kilo of dry matter in both. No difference for dry matter intake, but we do have differences in live average daily gain, live gain to feed, and hot carcass weight. Okay. The NDF didn't tell us anything about the story. The starch didn't tell us anything about the story, but we have different performance outcomes. Okay. So I'm making this case, and I'm trying to be a little dramatic, right, to show you that NDF isn't doing its job. Okay, and some of the reason is because digestibility of forages differ. Okay, they can have the same NDF, but the digestibility of that NDF is quite different. And when I go talk to dairy nutritionists, if I didn't talk about NDF digestibility, they would have chased me out the room by now. Okay, so I want to pay attention to NDF digestibility. I think it matters on the feedlot side, not to the same extent as dairy and not even for the same reasons. Okay, so I'm going to explain why I think it matters for feedlot cattle. What we do with this type of sample is you take your forage sample, it gets sent off to the lab, and they measure the digestibility of that NDF at different time points. So just following the blue line, which happens to be wheat silage, you can see at 12 hours we have about 37% digestibility. At 30 hours there's about 50% digestibility. It goes up to about 60% at 120 hours, and it's not really moving anymore at 240 hours. 240 hours is 10 days. It's not in the rumen after 10 days, and if it's still there, it's not going to be digested anymore. The bugs, it's never leaving. Well, it'll leave if they get it small enough. It will not be digested in the rumen. It doesn't matter. The bugs have had all kinds of time to work their magic on that forage, and they haven't been able to break it down. Okay? They're never going to. Okay? But if you look at this response, the early time point, forage is probably in the rumen for about 30 hours or maybe up to 30 hours. So that rate of digestion in the first 30 hours probably matters. And let's think about why we're putting forages in feedlot diets. It's diluting out energy. So if this number is lower, there's a greater energy dilution, isn't there? Which means there's less available for that animal. So let's compare barley silage. And again, these are Alberta averages, okay, from Cumberland Valley. They could have the same amount of NDF, but the digestibility of that NDF is different. Okay? And maybe more importantly, the indigestibility is important or is different. Okay? So this is the same data, just flipping it around, right? If 100% of the dry matter is either digestible or indigestible, this is the digestible side, it goes up. So the indigestible side goes down, or the undigested material. So this is the outcome for that 240 hours of incubation. And we're looking at how much of that NDF will never be digested in the rumen of an animal, okay, a rumen of cattle. Okay, and again, you can see that there's differences. Wheat silage has higher UNDF than barley silage. So from an energy dilution standpoint, it will have a greater effect to dilute the energy content of the diet. Probably can't see it numerically, but remember we're dealing with animal biology and not analytical chemistry. So the other aspect we need to think about is physically effective NDF, and this is a very common term in the dairy world. And we have good recommendations for over 25 years for dairy cattle. The recommendations for feedlot cattle are crap. Okay, we don't know it well. I don't think we standardize how we measure PE-NDF, or physically effective NDF. Some people do it on a diet, which includes the cereal grains in the diet, and all the PE-NDF is a percentage weight of the material that's retained on a given sieve. A lot of barley can be retained on a 4mm sieve. So if you shake out a whole diet, that barley grain is contributing a lot to the PE-NDF. Okay? So we have some problems. And when we look at feedlot cattle, try to use dairy information, try to take advantage of the same species in a different production system, our diets are out of bounds. We're extrapolating beyond what the dairy would ever consider, so we can't use their recommendations. Dave Mertens, who developed the system for the dairy, suggested 12 to 18% PE-NDF if we want to maximize average daily gain, greater than 22% if we want to minimize liver abscesses. So again, it depends what our goals are. Fox and Tedeschi suggested 7 to 10% to maintain ruminal pH. Those are tremendous differences, aren't they, in the same recommendation? There's very little standardization. What about UNDF? We know dairy cattle can't eat more than 0.44% of their body weight as UNDF, or it's very difficult for them to eat more. What are the recommendations for UNDF for beef cattle? There weren't any. Okay? So I'm going to show you what we've learned through BCRC funded research, and this is one of the benefits of that 5-year cluster program. We could sit down and focus for 5 years learning what we could about PE-NDF and UNDF for feedlot cattle. Quite often we're extreme in research settings, so I wanted to understand PE-NDF and UNDF. So how do we have a control? Well, we create a control where we don't add fiber. Okay, so this is a zero forage diet, 95% barley grain. We have a fairly high vitamin and mineral inclusion because we don't have a micro machine when we're hand mixing diets. So we have a fairly large carrier, almost 58% starch, 15% NDF. Where does that NDF come from? Just barley grain, right? Barley grain has a lot of fiber. UNDF sitting around 4.9. Okay, so this is if we do nothing and bring in no fiber. We took straw, so it says pelleted fiber, but it's wheat straw. And we either chopped it or we got the same bales pelleted. Okay? Pelleted straw should not have physically effective NDF by definition. It's been ground so that we can create a pellet. Okay? The chopped fiber has both UNDF and PENDF. Okay, so we're trying to separate out those two components, PENDF being the physical and the chemical contribution of forage, UNDF only being a chemical composition or component of forage. Okay, and not surprisingly, they're both the same right at that 6.8, 6.9. Okay, dry matter intake was not affected. NDF intake went up, as we'd expect, because we brought NDF into the diet. And UNDF intake went up and was not different between our diet with just UNDF and our UNDF with physically effective NDF. Told you we liked abbreviations, right? Eating time is affected. So how those cattle see that diet and consume that diet is different. It tends to get longer as we include more physically effective NDF or include physically effective NDF. They respond by ruminating more, okay? And they eat more meals when we put UNDF into the diet. So we're changing eating characteristics simply by bringing in this UNDF or UNDF plus PENDF. Mean ruminal pH goes up. Not surprising, we're also dropping starch, right? So we got to remember we're bringing in UNDF and PENDF, but we're also dropping starch. The duration of time that pH is below 5.5 drops pretty dramatically. Okay, so this would be our indication of rumen acidosis. And normally we would say if they're below 5.5 for 3 hours a day, they're probably in an acidotic state. Okay, they're 600 minutes, so it's like 10 hours. So pretty acidotic when we don't have any forage. Okay, short chain fatty acid concentration drops more when we have the same UNDF but have UNDF with PENDF. Okay, these are all cannulated cattle, obviously, because we can gain access to them. And one of the things we like to do is understand how feed moves through the rumen, so we can do evacuations and understand NDF turnover rates. You can see when we bring in UNDF and PENDF, we have more rumen mass. Okay, and that's important to think about. What does not account for carcass, or what reduces your dressing percentage? Non-carcass components, right? Digesta. So guess what? You're going to see later, we see quite often reductions in dressing percentage when we increase PENDF or UNDF. Okay, but there's some health outcomes for those cattle. Okay, when we look at ruminal NDF, we don't see much of an effect when we just bring in the UNDF, but when we have UNDF with PENDF, it's numerical, not statistically different, but a numerical increase. And we're seeing greater NDF passage out of the rumen, at least tending to be greater when we have UNDF and UNDF with PENDF. Now we always talk about rumen fermentation, and Rob brought in hindgut fermentation. We need to make sure fiber is flowing through the whole gastrointestinal tract. This is how ruminants evolved, right? And so this is evidence that we have more material flowing out of the rumen, flowing into the intestine, and that helps support intestinal health as well. Now we put balloons inside the rumen, and the balloons have pressure sensors, so every time the rumen contracts, it squeezes the balloon and sends a message to the computer. So we can see that including UNDF or PENDF actually increases contraction frequency. So the rumen is mixing more often. Okay? There's less time between contractions, which makes sense. And this is contraction area, so think about that as contraction force. So it's the pressure that squeezed in on that balloon, and numerically it's going up when we bring in UNDF and NDF. So let's think about those biological functions, right? We put in forage to enhance ruminal mixing, and we have to think about when feed goes in the rumen, the bugs are going to do all the fermentation, and those acids are going to sit there unless that digestate gets mixed, and those acids get exposed to the rumen wall. So without mixing, we can't absorb nutrients and we can't regulate pH. But it's showing very clearly that when we bring in UNDF or PENDF, we're enhancing that mixing capacity for the rumen. And of course, we can have diet-induced inflammation, and we see that often with grain overload or too much grain feeding. Look at the error bars. They're huge, and they always are on inflammatory markers. Okay, but in both cases, bringing in that UNDF or UNDF plus PENDF reduces evidence of systemic inflammation. Okay, we think this is probably similar in terms of risk for other outcomes like liver abscesses, because if these antigens are crossing the rumen, there's a chance bacteria are as well. Okay? So the point is both PENDF and UNDF impact cattle responses. So we wanted to show repeatability and more applicable dietary scenarios. So in this case, we have low or high UNDF. We use straw to manipulate our UNDF. And we thought UNDF content might interact with severity of grain processing. Okay, so inadequately processed on the 85% side, fairly aggressive on the 65% side because we're dealing with dry rolled barley. Okay. We saw some interesting responses where when we're low on UNDF, that aggressive barley processing reduced dry matter intake. Okay, makes sense. First thing cattle do when there's really low pH is they back off feed, right? It's their behavioral mechanism to reduce the impact of rumen acidosis. Okay, ruminating time tended to be higher with high UNDF, but again, a very differential response where it increased as our barley grain processing severity was reduced, and our total chewing time again was affected more strongly when we had low UNDF than when we had high UNDF. Okay, so we're probably at a point here on the low side where we're limiting the signals coming from the rumen to stimulate these normal physiological responses of ruminating and chewing. We saw that bringing in that UNDF, again, increased ruminal pH. This is, again, duration that pH is below a threshold. So we have lower time below that threshold. We would assume that would translate to lower risk for ruminal acidosis. Not surprising, it reduced digestibility, right? UNDF is undigested material or undigestible material. We should see a reduction in digestibility. Okay. In this study, we didn't see any response on inflammatory markers. Ran another study, 5, 10, or 15% forage inclusion. Again, lower high UNDF concentrations. You can see we're somewhere in that 6.6 to 9.7 UNDF range. Again, we see responses on rumen contractions. Okay, so we're increasing frequency of contractions again. Okay, pretty consistent. We're seeing these characteristic biological responses. No effect on rumen pH, but overall, average pH was above 6.1. So these cattle were managing this program quite well. Now, Rob was talking about liver abscesses, and we have a model to evaluate the potential for compounds to cross that gastrointestinal tract. We use chromium EDTA as an indicator. Now, chromium EDTA is small, but the assumption is if it crosses the gut, so can other things. Okay, and chromium EDTA doesn't get absorbed. It's crossing, or we think it's crossing between cells. So it tells us a bit about the leakiness of the gut. So the more chromium EDTA, the more leaky the gut is, and you can see with high UNDF, we actually reduce the leakiness of the gut. We decrease its permeability, and that fits pretty well with at least a numerical reduction in a pro-inflammatory marker, an acute phase protein, haptoglobin. Okay, so the data are fitting in quite well across studies, and recognize we ran 5 or 6 experiments where we saw fairly similar outcomes, not because we had to test this that many times, but if I'm going to tell you to start looking at UNDF or PNDF, I want to be pretty damn sure that it's going to be right. Okay? Okay, so what about growth? None of that was about growth, right? It was about, is the forage, or is our characterization of the forage appropriately indicating those biological or physiological responses? So in this study, we have barley versus wheat, low versus high PENDF, and then we brought in UNDF with straw to bump up our UNDF concentration. Not surprising, if we dilute the diet with more UNDF, we decrease average daily gain, we decrease dressing percentage, right? It's going to stick around in the rumen and still be there at the time of slaughter. Okay, and we also see a response with physically effective NDF. Okay, so we can be manipulating our dressing percentage based on the diet that's being fed. We also saw changes in carcass composition. So actually when we had more UNDF, we had higher yield grade 2 and less yield grade 3s. No effect on our quality grades. We think this might be related to that inflammatory response, because inflammation drives nutrients towards the immune system, which means it's taking nutrients away from lean tissue growth. Okay? We also tended to reduce severe liver abscesses with small pen work. Picking up a tendency in liver abscesses is pretty good. Okay? So once we finished that, we went back to the literature and we pulled all the studies we could find that reported NDF, and unfortunately nobody's reporting UNDF. So we had to go to existing commercial laboratory databases, try to match the forage type and, to the best of our ability, the time when that study was run. Okay. Now, in many publications, they don't tell you we ran the experiment from October 2021 till June 2022, right? They might not even tell you the year, so we had to do our best to predict when that experiment was done. Some of that was by contacting the authors and seeing if they would give us the dates, okay? We then used lab-derived UNDF values, okay? So if someone would have told me they're using lab-based UNDF values, I would have said, well, good luck, right? It's not even the specific forage that's being fed, it's the average of the forage tested in that region. That forage might not even have been tested at that lab. So this is the book value, okay? And we predict, or used a model to predict average daily gain and predict gain to feed, and we compared whether incorporating UNDF would improve the outcomes relative to just the NDF that they reported in the paper, okay? And lo and behold, when you look at our prediction error, so MSPE is our mean square prediction error, okay? RMSPE is our root mean square prediction error. Smaller is better, okay? UNDF improves or reduces the error associated with that prediction. CCC is our concordance correlation coefficient. Higher is better. And the Pearson correlation coefficient, again, higher is better. And again, even though these studies, or most of these studies, didn't report the actual UNDF, using book value UNDF values improved our prediction ability. Tells me that UNDF might actually matter for feedlot cattle. Okay, so these are your take-home considerations. I think there's value in thinking beyond percent roughage and percent NDF. So think about the barley you grew this year and the barley you grew last year. Are we just including the same percentage of barley because that's what we do? Or is there a reason to change the percentage inclusion rate? So if this barley is higher in fiber and lower in starch, maybe we don't need to use as much barley silage. That might work well in drought years when our barley silage tends to have higher fiber and lower starch. Maybe we actually don't need as much fiber. Okay? I think we need to think about ANDFOM, and not for all forages, right? Corn silage probably doesn't matter. Straws might matter a lot, okay, where there's potential for contamination. Showed you data on PENDF and UNDF, and I think there's opportunity with UNDF. I showed you data that PENDF and UNDF exert biological functions that we ask of forages. Okay, ruminal pH is affected in some studies, rumen motility in every study we measured it. Gut permeability or inflammatory markers are responding as we would expect in some of the studies. Other studies, no effect. Okay. When we account for UNDF, we improve our predictive ability for average daily gain and gain to feed. Okay, so it tells me there is a real life consequence. And again, while we need UNDF, if we put too much in, we have problems. So I think about the Brooks area where there was a nasty hailstorm and we might be feeding out corn stover rather than corn silage. Maybe UNDF matters. Maybe we should be thinking about how much corn stover we bring in to make sure that we're not overdoing or oversupplying UNDF, but at the same time still providing enough so that we don't reap negative outcomes caused by animal behavior or physiology, but we have in enough to stimulate rumen contractions and get those outcomes that we need. Okay? Think about that again when we're bringing in straw, if we need to bring in straw, or non-conventional forages. I think this is another way to look at that forage quality. Okay, so the point is when substituting forages, and that could be the same barley silage across production years or across pits, I think we need to think about maintaining UNDF to avoid production losses, not just think about, well, we had 10 or 8% barley silage, so we're going to put that in the next pit. It's not the same silage. That's all I got. Thanks, BCRC, for taking a risk on us and funding our work. I think we have some useful outcomes from this, and I hope it makes you think about forage a little bit different.
Thank you, Greg. I'm really glad you feel you've got useful outcomes from producer money. That's good. That's good. All right. We got time for a couple questions. It looks pretty quiet.
I can't believe they're letting you off that easy.
I think we have one online, Karen.
Perfect.
Thank you. Dr. Joyce says, does forage slash silage fiber length of different forages, example barley, wheat, corn, affect UNDF and PENDF health or performance?
Yeah, so forage particle length has no effect on UNDF. Okay, this is a chemical characteristic of the forage, but if we chop forage longer, we will increase our PENDF. Okay, I didn't focus that much on PENDF, but there is some positive responses from a rumen fermentation standpoint when we increase PENDF. The problem is, if we adjust our particle length, we create other issues, right? Silage packing becomes a problem. Getting that oxygen out, and so there's a huge trade-off, and that's part of why I didn't focus too much on chop length, because there's good reasons that we've chose the chop lengths we have, and we're not going to rewrite silage agronomy, right? That's out of our scope. I think that's unreasonable to expect. But even within a given chop length, we have forages with different UNDF, and that's affected more by maturity at harvest and the growing conditions. And I think it's important to know what those are so that we can adjust our diet formulation.
And Fucon was wondering, I'm wondering how many of producers today attending this seminar talk about talk about the PENDF and UNDF in their steers finishing diet with their nutritionists.
How many people think about PENDF or UNDF right now? I suspect few, unless you're interacting with dairy people, because I think that's really the only place I see it prominently. Hopefully this gives you something to think about and start evaluating and measuring and creating bench lines so that you can incorporate it in the future.
Thank you. What about the fibrolytic enzymes?
What about fibrolytic enzymes? Yeah, for UNDF, they shouldn't have an effect, right? That material has had all kinds of exposure to fibrolytic enzymes in vitro. If it was amenable to hydrolysis, it would have been broke down and it wouldn't be there anymore. So I don't think we'll see a change in terms of UNDF concentrations. I think what we would change is the rates of degradation. So when I plotted the pattern of responses, I think you could accelerate earlier degradation rates.
Greg, what's your opinion using oat hulls as a roughage and NDF source in feedlot cattle diets?
Yeah, I think the question can even be bigger. Oat hulls or any byproduct forage source, we never got into that aspect when we went through this research. So I'm not sure how UNDF from oat hulls contributes to some of these same effects. I think it will. That's my gut feeling, but I don't have any data to support or disprove that.